Besides foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to the
broadcast from later. Udit Vera, Vala Simmons, Macy Shu, Erica Whyte is here. Erica's an illustrator, painter, writer, and foresight strategist and friend. And weak signals are early signs of potential developments that may influence futures in significant ways. Each of us have brought in a weak signal of change. We haven't heard each other in advance, and we will, over the course of the show, try to unpack and make sense of, understand what the potential impacts on possible futures might be from each of these weak signals. Aldous, what's your weakest signal?
The changing relationship to sound that's occurred during COVID and people's experience of sound and how we think about it and feel it and experience it. And this was like triggered by reading an interview with a designer who spoke about more specifically like the sonic design of domestic spaces, because we're now always on Zoom and other communication tools, like all of the ways that our interiors like bounce sound around suddenly become like much more significant, and like we both get more distracted by the sounds and also like maybe want like a clearer sound to come out through the recording or the transmission of the call and everything. So on the one hand, there's like, is there going to be more attention paid to these kinds of like subtle things? Like even in my house, not just because of Zoom calls, but also just like I live with somebody and like their sounds and things become so much more familiar and louder too somehow during COVID. Like so many things have become louder. And so like we've been talking about getting like dampening things like for the apartment, like rugs and whatever stuff we can put on the walls to like try to dampen sound. And I feel like during COVID, there's been like a giant, and I'm not sure why, and I've seen articles, but I haven't read them on why people are like experiencing different sounds as being louder, you know? Earlier in the spring, it was birds were like so loud for me. And then it was like cars were just like, every time I walked, they felt so loud. And one route to take that as a signal is the question of the design of sounds and design of spaces and stuff like that. And then another one is like a slightly weirder one that I don't know if I'll be able to connect it, and you guys can tell me what you think. But the way COVID has been psychedelic experience in like not being about you, you know, like typically psychedelics are about dissolving the boundaries of ego and stuff like that, and heightening the senses in different ways. And I'm just wondering if any of this like sonic stuff that I've been experiencing is like related to this idea of COVID being like a psychedelic experience where all of society is having to deal with like the fact that it's not about them for the first time.
So
I'll leave it there.
Yeah, so just starting with the first one, the signal is primarily your own observation. And there's a designer that you also referenced, or that is the source of the signal. And what was that?
Talking about Zoom and stuff, domestic interiors.
Zoom and domestic interiors. So was that both visual aesthetics and sonic qualities, or that they were looking at?
Oh, sound in particular. They're talking just like no designer was like paying attention to these kinds of questions before, you know? Like when you went into a room, you didn't think about like, oh, like the placement of different objects would like affect the room acoustically, or the apartment or whatever acoustically.
Got it.
I'm sure some people were thinking about it. If you were like a DJ or a producer at home, like making music at home,
yeah,
I'm sure you were thinking about that.
If you're recording vocals at home, you would think about it, but not in general. You didn't pay that much attention to that in spaces.
I definitely think about rugs, like, but I think that's like when the sound poses as a problem.
Yeah, I mean, one thing we often think about when we think about signals is like, what's the change? Like, I feel like this is a thing that people used to think about a lot more before, when people spent a lot more time indoors thinking about the quality of other people's sound and other like the effects of other people's sound a lot more than they do now. So I think maybe like something changed over the last like 20, 30 years, and then we're back to a place where we're spending a lot more time indoors. But I think the particular change that you're talking about is like how the sound is affected over telecommunication also, over video conferencing also, right?
Or because of that situation that's causing us to feel effects of sound more.
First thing that came to mind was like an audio shui, like a feng shui, but for audio.
Yeah.
and trying to design some sort of like perfect domestic environment. But I think it also comes down to like having to maybe sit with some of that silence, because like heavily or dense urban areas all of a sudden were quite silent as well, just with people maybe leaving or being indoors more, not as active, also having to like manage and deal with that sense of silence.
Or just like think of cars becoming more and more insulated for like 20, 30 years. Like you go, if you've been in an older car, like they're loud as like the outside of the world and the engine and everything is so loud. And a new car is like nothing, it's just silent.
Remember Uday, when we were in Shanghai and it was like very surprisingly quiet?
Yeah.
Because it was all like
all electric cars,
vehicles, and so even though we were in like a highly dense urban environment, it was like eerily quiet.
Yeah, it was really weird how quiet it was, considering how dense it was. The reason why Zoom has done so well is because specifically of like how it deals with sound, right? Like the reason why it's called Zoom also is because it does this thing where it buffers the sound really well. It kind of like telescopes the sound over time, so that, you know, if there's like a gap in the way you hear the sound on the other end, it kind of fills that space up really well. And so I'm just wondering, like, what is the role and like what are the ways in which like the video conferencing software especially deals with ambient sound?
And hardware too. I mean, increasingly like people are looking for headphones that block out atmospheric sounds because they're like, I don't want to hear your background.
On the flip, it's like, yeah, I'm just thinking about like the activity that you end up doing in your space ends up changing, and therefore maybe it's a little more lively.
Right, like you need different kinds of qualities of sound in your space, and so like maybe the feng shui, audio feng shui needs to be adaptable for different kinds of flavors of sound.
Because we're doing every single activity in our room.
I heard in some places that you're not allowed to like vacuum at certain times in your homes. Like there's like laws against vacuuming. So it's like also like a courtesy thing. But I don't know if it has anything to do with Zoom. But just thinking about like laws.
Yeah, there's lots of interesting sound laws and bylaws out there around like why you're not allowed to move at night, things like that are allowed, as well as like preservation of sounds and the sort of activism around that. Armory Schafer, who's this Canadian theorist and composer who coined the term soundmark and I think soundscape as well, actually. Yeah, it's interesting that Zoom would be the thing that kind of like figures out a lot of the problems of audio of conference calls. It's like video app primarily, but you know, for the longest time, it almost seemed like the Polycom Sound Station, which was that like weird 3-ended Star Trek looking phone device that would appear in boardrooms everywhere, almost seemed like some kind of like instrument of the industrial business travel complex or something. Like it was just like, well, we can't do anything on the phone, we can't hear each other at all, so like you have to fly to Chicago and like get this work done. And it's just like it became all of a sudden so much easier to have a call, and so many of those rooms were just like, there had been so little thought in a lot of workspaces and business spaces around the acoustics, being on speakerphone and trying to talk to someone.
Well, let's talk more about the psychedelic experience.
It was just the inkling of something, and Eric Davis had brought it up before in some podcast that I listened to, where one way you can frame what has happened during COVID is that there's just this parallel between the way psychedelics typically operate, which is like a loss of ego. And then everything during COVID is kind of similarly like a forced loss of it being about you, you know, like you don't wear masks because it's about you. It's because you could become a vector, a transmission vector for other people, right? You are the risk to others. And so it's not like about you. And then all the things you want to do, especially all the consumption patterns that you used to have are just gone, right? Other than, well, immaterial consumption like Netflix and stuff like that. But like, yeah, eating out, going to concerts, retail, all that stuff is gone, which is all the stuff that's like geared towards you as like an ego and you as an individual satisfaction of your desires, right? Like all of that infrastructure is almost exclusively geared towards lighting some individualistic pleasure inside of you. And so people have to find other ways of occupying their time. And in that way, it kind of is a force function for the loss of ego or something like that.
Like the thing I find like a little bit frustrating about that metaphor, example, analogy is, do we find the concept of thinking collectively so foreign that we need to think of the most extreme example of psychedelics and ego loss to like imagine thinking about other people. I don't know, like if, to me that's like, it feels a little bit like, I don't know, like why do we need to think about psychedelics? It's the right metaphor here. Like this is just like thinking about other people, you know?
I don't know if it's the opposite, but I thought of it as like an echoic chamber, is that how you say it? Where like people who had been tested in them, people who had sat in them, weren't able to sit in them for very long because they weren't used to hearing the sound of their own bodies. Like they weren't used to hearing the sound of like their organs moving, like the fluids moving, their teeth grinding against each other. So it's like, and people in those tests ended up actually hallucinating.
Yeah.
So like, on the flip, it's like this dealing with the self.
And being forced to do so almost constantly.
And a completely different sensorial kind of like experience, I guess.
Yeah, it's yourself in some literal sense, but it's also like not yourself in the sense of like it's not your conscious normal self. It's everything that's like unconsciously operating. It's all the weirdness, you know, of fluids moving inside your body constantly.
Your bones grinding.
A lot of these ideas are bringing me to our Mary Schafer, who I mentioned before. Another term that he coined called schizophonia, which refers to the gap basically between your voice as you articulate it and your voice as it is being recorded and heard by Udit right now from me. Like, and I believe like it's used when kind of like thinking about like a lot of like tape loop type music and like why it's so eerie and it's like a Steve Reich. And I don't know, I always thought about like the way that in movies like The Ring or Ringu, like replication, something's lost in replication, quality goes down, degrades, and there's like strangely seems to be in the cultural mind like something spooky about that, something has a sense of like dis-ease about that or something. And I wonder if there's any relationship to this sense of self and replication of the self that's happening. Signal or noise? Would it?
I think it's a noisy signal.
Very good.
No pun intended.
Yeah. Yeah, what do you think it's a signal of?
Most immediately, I think people are going to be more aware of how to like arrange their rooms and stuff for better sound. It's not, I mean, I think it's already happening. Like I do that for this call, for example. But I think what I'm interested in seeing is like, okay, how does this change like consumer behavior? What are the new products that are going to come out? How are like our devices going to change to adapt to this? Things like that.
Nancy, signal and noise.
Yeah, I'd say again, it's like I hope is a signal. I hope it's kind of, it might lead people to like be more mindful of like deep listening and like confronting their sense of self, confronting the weird noises of themselves.
Erica?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's a signal to deal with something very unfamiliar, different, strange, weird, and in that change, I think, is there.
I'm going to say noise just because I think there's something there in the signal around attention to the senses. We could just as easily be talking about scent right now, for example, or you could like reframe it as being a signal around just like attention to the home, which I think like there's a lot of signals around rethinking the home right now and how it's used and attention to it, and even it being a space for living in as opposed to like just sleeping in for some people. Like there's.
But I think also just like in your environment as well. Like it's like the thing that is like the cars that Valdez was saying, really noticing those things more. And I'm like, everything is loud, but maybe that's also speaking to like everyone's like emotional state and like sense of perception right now.
One of my favorite histories, I guess, of sound or headphones, just because they've like taken this trajectory of like letting sound in, where headphones, like they began with like just being able to block sound out, you just being able to hear sound. And then slowly they now have this like ability to like let exterior sounds, like urban sounds in. I don't know, for that reason, I just think that with people maybe being more conscious about sound, that it has this ability to like shift the things we make and how we think about the things we make. You like just like press a button and it lets more sound in or lock sound out. Like what are those?
Sound canceling.
Noise canceling, yeah. Just thinking about like maybe how that relates to Zoom or like so tech and people trying to control the sounds that they come in.
Okay, Macy, what's your weakest signal?
Basically, it's a multiplayer game called Card v Card. And every player has a credit card that's linked to a bank account that sometimes has money in it. And you get a notification when money is dropped and you can spend it in whatever way you like. But you can only spend it in real life. So you run the risk of essentially being embarrassed that your account has been depleted because you don't know what people have spent on it. So they've called it kind of the world's first competitive multiplayer bank account. Essentially just like a play on personal finance, but the idea of being able to spend other people's money, but still running into the risk of not having enough money. It's an initiative that this agency called Mischief developed, and they do these kind of weird social experiments or products. But yeah, I just wanted to kind of see what you guys think about this. People are really interested in it. Is it just like the psychology of being able to spend money that's not yours, or are there like further implications of what this kind of behavior could be like? I haven't really thought this through completely, but yeah.
There's a lot that's fascinating. Can you give us a sense of like what's the sign up and like onboarding process to this game exactly? Like,
so it's like you sign up, you get a code, and so they release access codes like a few weeks before the drop. And if you're able to get one, they will mail you basically like a blank credit card, and it doesn't have a number on it because you can only use it in real life. So you can't like purchase things online. You have to like go to the store or something like that. And then you get notifications that there has been X amount that's dropped into the shared bank account. And then you can spend whatever you want, given the fact though that other people also have got that notification. So other people are probably spending as well. So you have to make the judgment. Yeah, you have to be quick, and you have to make the judgment of like how much you think you can spend.
And you risk being embarrassed, and then if that happens, then you have to make the decision of, am I going to like pay for this or just like, leave the store?
Exactly. Or you're like, okay, maybe I'll just do like $1 or something like that. Yeah.
Who's funding this? Where's this money coming from?
Well, Mischief is like, they've gotten a lot of venture capital. I don't really know exactly, and they don't really say exactly how like this pot of money is continuously being added to.
This is an agency funded UBI.
Yeah,
this is the consumer capitalism we're living in.
It does sort of seem like one of these weird like game movies where like, you know, there's just like some evil contingency of rich guys behind it watching the people.
But like, could this model, I don't know, like, are there interesting beneficial things about this model, like having a
collective bank account?
Yeah,
gamified theft.
What did you call it?
Gamified theft.
Yeah, I know that's what a lot of it sounds like. That's what's interesting is you can read this as like, okay, collective bank account, like take what you need. Like, is that the direction that the signal goes? Is this really about what it feels like to be spending money that's not yours? In which I think there's like a lot of instances where that happens and people feel pleasure, responsibility, you know. It's just a signal of like the thrill of identity fraud.
Yeah, you're racing against other people who are in on it as well.
Right. This is like, or is this just like the updated version of like, what was that, like supermarket sweepstakes or whatever? Like,
right.
Like globally distributed supermarket sweepstakes. Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, it kind of seems like in-app purchases, but on steroids, which I think is what Mischief kind of goes for. It's like,
yeah,
they just go for like these like absurd models of like drops and products and services and like these packages. It's people are doing it. So
yeah,
mischievous economic stimulus package.
Stimulation package for the attention economy.
Wait, Mischief is the company that this is like promoting?
MSCHF.
And what do they do?
They do like bi-weekly drops of these weird things that's meant to delight people. I don't know, like weird experiences or products.
Dropping like over stock and stuff? Like, is it like a winners for millennials?
I don't think so, because it's not like there's no stock or anything. Like it's not a store. It's just cash. Or you're asking about what is Mischief?
Yeah, I'm just trying to figure out what Mischief is.
Mischief is more like an agency or a studio, I think, right? When it focuses on like experiential stunts and stuff like that. Yeah, somewhere between a advertising firm and a art collective.
Yeah, they view themselves as like a collective because they don't really have clients. They don't really do ads per se.
Mm-hmm. I'm so curious where they're getting the money from to do this. That's the most important question for me for this signal.
Investors. Well, that's also another thing. Like,
what are the investors getting out of this
model?
Yeah. I think it's like a luxury good thing. Like a lot of this stuff seems like it's luxury good stuff.
Do you
Yeah.
pay money in to a pool that then you can spend, like I pay
Redistribute.
20, you pay 20, we have $100 card, and then somebody gets this,
No,
is it
it's
that
free.
model?
It's free. But you need, like, I don't think everyone would have access to it. So, like, you need to be able to get the access code. So there's, like, I guess some exclusivity that way, but I don't know by what criteria. But other than that, no, you don't pay in anything.
Does it result in like any real items or just a money transfer?
Basically has to result in, I don't know, some sort of purchase. Can't really do like a transfer. It's more like you need to buy something. Like,
It'd be interesting if this was like a project of like the Federal Reserve to try to like induce stimulus and consumer spending in some way, because there's like a demand side slump in the economy. And so like this is like a way to get people excited, and
Yeah.
like a Black Friday type of event where it's just like go spend, like
Yeah.
manically, like
yeah, like this, they have the slogan that they have on the card is like buy, buy, buy.
Right.
I'm curious, like, could it be applied to like for good,
Mhm.
for social good?
Right. I wonder, is there anything to the game of it beyond just racing to spend the money? Is it just like the social experiment around like what people are willing to risk, or how much value they place in like not being embarrassed in public and things like that? So, like, it reminds me of like the movie Trading Places, or these weird, the Duke brothers are trying to create some weird social experiment to what happens when you give Eddie Murphy all this money and take it away from Dan Aykroyd.
I want to know how many people are doing this too.
They're logging the transactions live.
If they're logging the transactions, maybe like the value is like people's like voyeurism in like looking at these transactions.
But it doesn't
And seeing
say
people are
what they
spending on.
buy.
It's content.
Mm.
Oh, okay. Oh, it doesn't say what they buy.
Well, it
Interesting.
says like the location and the amount. It says the amount.
Or if it's just like a full experiment on or social commentary on excessive spending, like
Yeah.
those social games that like expose McDonald's for conveyor belt meat or whatever. It's pink slime, like games like that.
Yeah, they have like this manifesto, and the true dream of personal finance is no strings attached. Card versus card enables all player to experience in a microcosm the dream of expense account living, a vaguely bottomless supply of ambiguous dark money.
So there's a bit of a commentary there.
Like it seems like it's like positioned as a public service announcement, but it's actually like an ad for Amex or something. No?
It's so confusing to me. I don't really get it. Like, why?
I don't think there's a why necessarily.
What's the game theoretical like equilibrium or whatever for what you should try to purchase every time? Because you want to hit like the max amount, but just under what would be the...
In the transaction log, most things are like under, actually it goes from like 100 something to like $1.
Like in a totally fair world, if that all that money was going into a shared bank account, like the amount that you are sort of eligible to, I don't know if that's like the right term to use, is like the total money that's being put in divided by the number of people who are participating in this experiment, right? So
Right.
as long as you can hit a number that's over that, that's like, in a sense, you're winning, if that's how we want to frame this whole experiment.
Right.
So
That's
like that, yeah, so I would like try to just make purchases over that number, whatever that number is. So for
But you
example, if it's,
know what that number is.
oh, you don't know what that number is.
No, you don't.
I'm just so confused by this whole thing. I don't know what the signal is. I don't know why they did it. I don't know who's funding it. It seems like a scam.
I think it's a criticism of the gamification of credit cards, like the incentivization through things like point systems and all these different sort of things that are set up to work against the desire to actually just like build good credit. They've created the extreme of it to sort of reveal everything that's wrong with the way credit cards are set up to exploit people.
Except like the only feeling or affect it generates is the like anticipation and excitement of the free
Spending more.
stuff that you could get, right? So it just feeds, it's like gasoline on the fire, right? It's just feeding that.
Yeah, I don't know
fire.
that it's a very successful criticism or whatever.
The exclusivity, maybe. It's like, I got a card.
If one got a card.
Yeah, if one got a card.
Yeah, credit cards as status symbols are interesting because it's not actually a thing. It's like the ability to get things that you're signaling.
I like the idea that like, could it be something other than what it is? Like, could it be the way Macy you were talking about it, like some kind of vision of like collectivized finance, you know, like the seed in some way of some form of like bizarro, spending based on like whatever you need or want, as opposed to limits that you have for whatever other reason, how much money you have. But maybe it's not a signal, it's just like a trend of these kinds of like mischief itself, because I've been looking it up right now, because I don't know, I never really like paid attention to it. And like the rise of these kind of like weird like stunt companies, like I don't know what else to call them, you know, like where they just create things that garner attention, which in some way is linked to like what ad companies used to do, but they're way more adapted to like going viral in a way that ad companies were more focused on generating like slow returns to attention or something. These things are designed to just these things are designed to like blow and grab and steal as much temporarily as possible. And like there is something so weirdly effective about it. Like it's this very American thing where it's like this thing that you like love to hate or something. It immediately gives you that feeling.
Yeah, the other thing was like that was I wanted to kind of chat with you guys about. It's like, what is this business model that like they're using? And
MMT, it's a anti-MMT, which is the idea of modern monetary theory that you can just print as much. Government is not limited by the amount that it can tax. It's limited by the amount that an economy can withstand.
Absorb.
I don't know if it's pro or anti-MIT, who knows?
It's just a distraction from other things that matter, and particularly like the distraction from the fact that the spending, you might focus more on the points than on the repaying your debts and actually building credit. It's about getting people's attention in that way. And this is like the ultimate of that. It's like, are people willing to be that distracted from potentially doing something else where they might spend time and earn more money or build more credit? I don't know. Signal and noise, Erica?
I'm going to say noise, because it's not really doing anything that I see so far as different or outside of like usual gamification strategies, but they are doing it in a really like aesthetic and interesting way that's garnered attention. So yeah, I'm a bit confused about what the model is and what they're trying to actually, like, what's the message or whatever.
Noted. Signal and noise.
I think it's a signal of the 4D marketing that we're seeing, where you don't really know what they're marketing, what they're trying to sell. It's like it's somewhere between like marketing and scamming. Okay. Like basically the rise of the stunt companies to sell things.
So what are they marketing though?
That's the question. I don't know. It's interesting though. Like I want to know what they're marketing. Maybe they're just marketing themselves.
Yeah, their own brand.
But it seems like it's funded by American Express. So
I don't think it is.
Oh, you don't think it is?
Yeah, they have a MasterCard logo on the cards too. So they're using a few different companies as references. Who knows what it is? It could be the National Retail Association. It could be like shopping malls. It could be whatever.
Yeah.
It could be the Fed.
Interesting. Valdez?
I would want it to be something of the versions of like experimenting with different forms of banking and finance. I don't think it is, but I would want it to be that. I think there is stuff in that vein that's happening that does constitute like signals towards that area of like change. Well, you know what? Maybe sure. Like I think this is enough of like another added piece of evidence to like the notion that something might happen with the way that we think about organizing our like finances, and then we might see a period of experimentation with it.
I feel like we've gone down this path before, but I sort of like that this is like Marcel Duchamp, like art finance moment or something, where we're getting like a new form of art through the stunt studio. So I'll say it's a signal. Erica, what's your weakest signal?
I wanted to do something around biomaterials, and I mentioned this, but folks making textiles out of bacteria, sometimes in DIY settings, but also in citizen labs. So the signal there would be like an organism approach to things. There's this designer named Jen Keynes, and she writes a little bit about this organism approach. But yeah, so far I've seen just a couple of different studios either do like textile intelligence or something around like skin or membranes and material being mostly made out of something that's fermented or made out of like, something that's fermented. So it's in part coming up because I guess surfaces during COVID and sanitation during COVID, people are wondering like, is this a microbiome thing or a microbial thing? People are also wondering how distancing is impacting our microbiome. So just all this stuff going on with like bacteria right now, and a couple communities that have like already this like complex supply chain. So I think it reckons with it just a little bit. People like experimenting with fermentation, biotech, and industrialization.
Wait, is there a specific instance that you're thinking of, or like just like a space more as a whole?
There's maybe Jenkins' organism approach.
Yeah, the Jenkins organism approach. There are like a couple different studios and people playing in the space where it's like they're either making clothes out of like grown SCOBY, or they're like doing a project and it's like based on material, but it's kind of fostering this idea around like the material being a membrane instead of like just a cloth to throw away. It's just like rethinking what the actual material or textile is and how it relates to nature and the environment.
And what do you think is the implications then for futures where you think this might lead?
I think because it's like more of a DIY thing, and it's like I haven't seen it in like a retail space. I haven't seen it like usable. It's mostly people just like playing in that space. I'm wondering if it's just like moving towards, more like local DIY thing, or if it's just people experimenting with fermentation, if it could actually have an impact on like biotech and industrialization of materials.
When you say organism approach, like what is the organism we're talking about? Is it like the human is the organism that's extended by the fabric, or are we talking about organism as in like the bacteria that is producing the materials for textile and fabric?
Yeah, I think it's the fabric, like it, especially in the case of like the SCOBY, like someone's like brewing SCOBY, taking the SCOBYs and making like a jacket out of it, or someone's like growing a material to make a shoe. So actually Jenkins' whole thing was like, this is grown. So it's like these objects that are grown instead of manufactured in a certain way, through a certain process.
Is cotton a biomaterial?
I mean, I think it's levels of like processing, right? Is like the distinction.
How much processing has occurred?
But do we think like these SCOBY materials, for example, would later then become like this huge manufacturing process? Like once, they've figured out a solution that can be easily replicable.
Well, I think the point is that it's local and DIY.
Yeah, I thought it was kind of like a movement around people fermenting and craft, and just like artists are often concerned with the materials that they're using. So it's just like a bit of experimentation there, but also being able to just like pinpoint exactly maybe where certain things are coming from down the supply chain. I thought that was a key point.
Grow your own materials is a interesting provocation, and I think it's like an interesting provocation, especially when you like contrast it with like things like additive manufacturing, like 3D printing, for example, which is like selling the same type of dream of like local self-sufficiency, but it's like a very different approach to that, where you're not like, it's not additive manufacturing, it's like natural growth manufacturing or something.
It could very well just be like a marketing thing where it's like flip on in your brain about how you like view clothes or textile or material. Like it's something that's not just easily thrown away. It could also be something that you have to like care for in a different way because it's an organism.
It'd be interesting if it didn't die or something, or if it was still living while like living clothing in some form where it adapted or it changed or whatever on the basis of like how you used it and treated it. And like it's like a culture, like a SCOBY that you have, like a t-shirt is like a SCOBY that you have to like take care of, and wash it in the right ways. Otherwise it like gets sickly looking, and like you could imagine all sorts of forms of behavioral possibilities that you could try to think of,
Growing, I mean, there's like a regenerative aspect too. So like I believe Jenkins did like a midsole or like something from a shoe, and something like that, what we're used to is like a rubber shoe sole or something like that, it wears down with use, like on a running shoe or whatever. The idea that you could grow that part back is kind of an interesting idea when it comes to like care. Like, could you create like a shoe that lasts forever because certain parts of it are living?
In line with like the reuse repair movement that you're like regrowing.
Yeah, growing versus sewing.
What is like the environment or the petri dish or the substrate that this is grown in? Could you grow it on your own body? Like, could I just like get some like, I don't know, stuff and put it on my body and grow like biomaterials naturally, like directly from my body? That would be cool.
Probably can, but you need to like keep that surface really moldy and like, I don't know, protect it and feed it, and I don't know what it'll do to your skin. Maybe that's
another question.
Fusion.
It'd be cool if each item also like self-replicated, so that like, let's say you had a t-shirt and then like a tree, every branch is like a replication of the tree, and the t-shirt started sprouting like another shirt from itself. And at first it's just this small thing that hangs from the side of it, you know?
Baby shirt.
Yeah. And
then-
everything did that. It lasted.
And then I can like
forever.
get a stem of yours and then bring
Yeah,
it.
you could do a cutting.
I like the idea of it being biodegradable, something that you know is going to wear down, like you mentioned. But I don't know if I would actually wear any of the ideas that have been popping up. Like, I don't know if I would wear a SCOBY jacket, or I did see a jacket that was made, it was called Dimpora, and they had marketed it as like a membrane. And it was just like revolutionary technology, membrane technology. And I know that materials are like called membranes, but yeah, it's just that flip in your brain when you hear something like that.
People make like clothing with like mushroom leather. That's a thing.
Yeah,
That already
like,
happens.
for sure. It's getting big.
Yeah.
Yeah, I feel like the mycelium materials is going.
I think I've seen like SCOBY packaging, but not necessarily like full clothing. I guess
Yeah,
clothing as well, like there's that aesthetic element, right? It's like, how do you make it fashionable? Especially if you can make it into something that is like more sustainable than like a one-off, you know, meat dress type of thing.
Meat dress.
More sustainable than the one-off meat dress, yeah. And I wonder what the potential consequences are. It's like a lot of the material innovations seem like they're going to be more sustainable or efficient or something at the beginning, and don't always turn out to be.
The scaling, though, right? Usually.
It's usually the scaling that ruins everything, or the.
It leads to like the over processing. You have to like get it everywhere, which means that you need to like burn fossil fuels to get it around, ship it around.
Well, like
Like, it's
plastics
all-
or something might have been like a sustainable material had we not like treated it like something that could just be tossed away.
Yeah.
But what if it's just like everyone would have the skill to do it? It's just like growing your own food, right? Like
Yeah.
have your own garden, you are living sustainably off your land, and you're growing and making your own clothes within your household neighborhood.
Living off the lab.
Yeah, living
Yeah,
off
living off the lab.
Yeah.
That's a great signal.
Yeah, I wonder if it's like a closeness to material or a closeness to even the process. It's like an extension of weaving, but like, yeah, it's like a closeness to, like with plants, like you take care of your plants or whatever, like you're getting closer to it. Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah.
You're speaking to it, you're nurturing it, and then like you're able to wear it, and then there's like a life cycle to it.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean that's cool too in terms of just the value of like that comes with the intimacy of creation and stuff and making. Like certainly when someone knits you a scarf or something, you're like, that's a very special item. When someone gives you food that they've grown from their garden or whatever, that's also very special. And this would be similar.
But there, you know, back in the day, people would make their own clothes, and there was like this whole self-sufficiency, grow your own clothes. Do you guys know what the Indian national flag looks like? Which has like this circle and the wheel in the middle. The wheel is a symbol of fabric self-sufficiency. Because that's what you use to spin cotton into thread. And that was the first kind of symbol of civic disobedience and resistance when the Indian population stopped buying clothing and fabric from the British and started making their own fabric as a way of sort of like consumer resistance to like industrial processing of cotton that was produced in India but sold to Indians at a markup, routed through the Indian industrial process.
And that does feel like it rhymes with sort of like the symbolic space and culture that biomaterials are taking up right now.
Yeah,
and like people associate that. That's really interesting.
And like silkworms in China, right? Like people would make like silk from their own silkworms in their garden. It's not that different from things we've done in the past. Biomaterials and specifically fermentation is having a moment right now in a way that it hasn't had before.
I guess I'm wondering if it's like, if it changes how you think about waste, or especially with the sanitation surface thing, it's like, are people interested in bacteria because they think it's like going to change the way like we understand bacteria and how it affects our surfaces, given COVID?
Yeah. We can become one with the bacteria.
Oh, we're bacteria murderers these days.
Nobel Prize in chemistry went to this lady, Francine something I forget what, but she does work on this like bacterial engineering. And all of their stuff is already being like deployed, even like at scale. Like it's not a DIY craft thing. It's harnessing the power of like bacteria as a factory to produce synthetic materials, because they are essentially little tiny engines of chemical production, right? And so if you engineer them in the right way to produce different kinds of molecules that are needed in industrial processes, it's like already happening. They're already doing it like at a giant scale, like at an industrial scale, which is cool, I think.
Yeah,
I would
that's
love to
cool.
visit a factory like that.
Yeah, and what's produced in those cases is not necessarily something that's biodegradable, particularly, right?
I'm not sure. I think they're like raw material inputs for other industrial processes, other like chemical processes. I'm not sure what, depends maybe on what the end product that's produced from all that stuff.
Yeah.
And they might only be a
Chemicals.
part of the processing cycle, right? They might not be the entire cycle.
Right.
Like
That's
they can
true.
make it stronger and more durable in different ways with other chemical processing parts of this in the process.
They're using bacteria as little workers in a factory.
Clock in, clock out.
Yeah.
Bacterial labor.
Bacterial leisure time.
You know.
SCOBY is a union.
All right, well, signal and noise. Udit?
I mean, I think it's a continued signal of like normal sort of public interest around mycology, fermentation, all of the stuff that we've been seeing in the last few years. I don't know if it's anything more than that.
Yeah, I would like to think it could be a signal for just like these skills being commonplace. Like, you know, there are these like workshops that kids go to now for like DIY bio stuff. So it'll be cool to see this as like a skill building capacity that like everyone might have in the future.
It is remarkable that like DIY bio has not proven to be like merely a trend or something. Like this has been going and growing 10 years strong. Well, way more than that, I guess, but gaining interest and stuff for a while. Valdez, signal and noise.
Like in regard to like the politics of it, like I brought up that industrial example because I don't think it necessarily leans in some direction of like localized production or whatever. In the same way that the arts and crafts movement at the end of the 19th century wasn't in and of itself some kind of like powerful force. It was just like a remainder, an excess remainder of the industrial process that like, I don't know, is significant for a lot of reasons, but isn't significant for the sake of being some revolution in how production is going to happen, you know? I think some of the stuff around like metaphors of like membranes and clothes is cool. And just like, I think there could be a lot of room to reconceptualize clothing that I think would be exciting, that maybe some of these materials, if they're living and whatnot, could help us do. And if they're like adaptable and all this stuff that comes, the characteristics that come along with being living, self-reproducing, degradable, that could be very cool and impactful. So, yeah.
I guess I read it as more like growing trend, but I think there's also a lot of signals we could probably like pinpoint. And I always like talking about this space because it's an important growing trend that is going to influence futures in a lot of ways. But there's a lot to the constellation of it. What's your weakest signal?
So I'm trying to find a weak signal between these two big environmental reporting pieces I read in the last few months. And I think together they kind of symbolize our signal or something, but I'm not totally sure what. But maybe you all can help me figure that out. So the two pieces are, the first one is an article called The Deep Anthropocene, which was in Eon magazine, I think a couple months ago. And the other one is like a series of reporting that a lot of different outlets have doing, including NPR, about how recycling is a scam and a myth, which I think you might have all kind of heard of in the last few months also, because it's kind of been ongoing. I think there was a Netflix show about it. Rolling Stone had some coverage on it. NPR has done quite a bit on it. So, and both of these are sort of related to a big sort of public perspective shift around the environment. So the first one is the Deep Anthropocene. And basically, it's creating this argument about how the Anthropocene isn't something that's happened in the last like 50 years, which is the way that it's typically talked about. And rather, there has been a long stretch of time, even the pre-industrial era, that was not, that where humans were responsible for sort of transforming the environment, ecologies, and our sort of natural environment, right? And so they point to all of these examples, a lot of them that have come to light now because of new mechanisms they have for measuring and doing archaeology, so spectral analysis, things like that, where they're looking at like, you know, what kind of animals were cooked together by like analyzing residue on cookware and things like that. And seeing, oh, okay, well, you know, all the way back to 5000 BC, 7000 BC, humans had vastly changed the shape of migration patterns, where different animals were domesticated, different species of both plants and animals, and so on. So I guess the point is that the influence that humans have had over the environment has been a lot longer than we think it has been. And it's not just the sort of industrial era in the last 50 years that we've done a lot of massive changes to the environment. So that's the first environmental piece that I wanted to talk about. And then the second one is about the myth of recycling. So all of this reporting, I think, traces back to one article in Science Advances in 2017, which basically talks about how since the 1950s, we've produced about 6.3 trillion kilograms of plastic waste, and 91% of them have never been recycled. So only 9% of them have actually been recycled. Yet we have this sort of narrative around individuals and consumer responsibility to recycle things, right? And Larry Thomas, who's the former president of Society of Plastics Industry, has this quote, which is kind of famous in this reporting, which is, if the public thinks that recycling is working, then they're not going to be as concerned about the environment. And so the idea is that Big Oil and Big Soda put out this narrative and manufactured this narrative around recycling just so that they could
make people feel better about themselves.
Yeah, make people feel like good about themselves and not have to worry about the global environmental calamity that we're all facing right now. Yeah, so I guess like the way I see these connected is obviously the fact that there's been like this rapid kind of shift in public perception of what human impact on the environment is, both in terms of timescales, but also in terms of like what it is, right? Like, and who's responsible. And because it's so global, like to me, I think what it signals is like a greater appetite for understanding how humans are deeply entangled with the environment. So the kind of response we need is global, mass, and not individual. And so I wonder if it's going to lead to like more arguments for things like terraforming, geoengineering, things like that, where we're talking about, okay, humans are deeply, deeply changing the environment. They've always been since the dawn of humanity. And, you know, the response that we're going to have is not individual. It has to be collective because the individual response has never worked. And so, yeah, that's my signal.
How much of, from both of those, like we'll do one at a time, do you think is surprising? I have questions about the first part, right? The deep Anthropocene. Humans have influenced the environment for longer than expected. So is the idea that we've influenced it as much for the entirety of history of humans, or and it hasn't accelerated in the past 200 years? To measure, right?
Yeah, I think it's a hard thing to measure, but it's also like, I think a lot of it has to do with communication, which is when you say Anthropocene, and like we're living in the Anthropocene right now, it's framed as though this is a post-industrial thing, that since the 1950s, we're living in this era where humans are massively transforming the environment. And what that signals to people is that pre-industrial era, there was this pristine, sort of untouched nature, and that we were not affecting. But as soon as you start talking about the deep Anthropocene, you're changing the framing. You're saying, okay, well, actually, no, there wasn't a single moment in time. It's happened since the beginning. And we're actually deeply entangled and deeply entwined with the environment, which is something that I think we have talked about a lot, but the fact that this is being talked about more in sort of the public spaces and in like mainstream publications now in a way that's very accessible. I think shifting the narrative around like what is the role of humans in transforming the environment, right?
It becomes a very weird question if you were to try to measure human influence over the environment versus, at least rhetorically, no other species has a geological age named for it or trying to be named for it here. Fine for that idea. But like
the non-nuanced sort of perspective on this would be like, if you're making this sort of argument, like I think people would be worried about, well, is this an argument for not doing anything about climate change, for example? Because, you know, like you can argue that humans have always been changing the environment, so why should we care about it now? Right? It's sort of natural in a sense for humans to change the environment. To me, this is an argument of being more deliberate about how we're shaping the environment, which is like, we know that we're shaping the environment. We always have been. So like maybe we need to think about it more as like, you know, sort of like engineering, geoengineering, terraforming sort of way, which I think Valis has talked about here as well, from a different point of view.
And is there also like a signal of like greater sort of reflexivity around our apparently special feature of as human beings to both recognize ourselves as animals and to clearly believe ourselves to view nature from a fold within nature as though it's something separate from ourselves?
Like anthropocentrism or something like that?
Yeah. The whole conversation feels like there's that part involved, you know?
Yeah. I mean, like, I think like these deep Anthropocene type of people would argue that the framing of the Anthropocene post-1950s has been talking about humans as separate from nature. right? That this is the human era in a way, and before that there was a sort of natural era. Right?
But the Bible did that too, right?
Yeah. But like these deep Anthropocene people would argue that actually that's not the case. It's always been interactive. You know, there's a back and forth between nature and culture, and nature and humans, and whatever, and humans are part of nature. The signal to me is like how this interrelates with like other signals in the environmental reporting space right now, like especially like this plastics one. This is another example, I think, of how one is like the narrative around what is human influence, and the other one is like what is our response to human influence, right? Like recycling as a narrative, and both are kind of changing at the same time. And I wonder how like they interact. Is that to me is like the interesting thing, which is like, are we going to see more of like a global response, because possibly could we be thinking about longer timescales, and possibly could we be thinking about what is the non-individual response, and how do we make sure that the response itself is shaping the environment as well, not just mitigating or reducing human impact, but shaping human impact.
In line with the narrative thing, that was exactly what I was thinking about. It's also like, how did these narratives become the mainstream, and like the people with the power to like push these narratives to be viewed as like the authority or wherever, as opposed to like other narratives that have existed for so long, like indigenous narratives or other types of narratives that are more in line with kind of, I guess, the shift that you're seeing now.
And why were reduce and reuse so underemphasized in this 3 R's?
Reduce, reuse, regrow. That's the new R's, 3 R's.
Yeah, it made me think about how, or question how different recycle systems are globally, and how synonymous that maybe mantra is. But one case that came to mind was placing the ownership of trash or recycling on the individual. So like there weren't any garbage bins publicly, so that the ownership of
in Japan they don't have as many public garbage bins, so that you are, and because they have such a strong sort of shame system in place, people are forced to take the garbage back home and deal with it in a way that's.
And they have like a very intricate system where it's like very, very, very specific things can be thrown out or recycled or.
But I guess you're questioning that whole system of recycling, or that at least what's popped up is that questioning of that recycle system.
Yeah, the one piece I was reading was talking about how when you recycle a plastic bottle, for example, the most that you can do with it is actually not even recycling, it's downcycling. So for example, you could use it to make a rug where you need like synthetic fibers. You will not be able to use it at the same level, such as like creating another plastic bottle with it. But the image that people have is that you're going to reuse it as a plastic bottle, which is like the image that people have with like cans, for aluminum cans, for example, which are reused in that way. But plastic is not like that. At the most, it gets downcycled and used once, but majority of it does not get downcycled at all.
I wanted to jump back to Japan for a second, just because so much of this seems to actually, of this conversation and the way you framed it, seems to do with beliefs in a way, and mythologies. That, if I'm not mistaken, in Shinto, Japanese religion, every object is thought of as having a soul or a spirit, which is like a very different view than, and I'm just thinking back what I made that reference offhand to the Bible is Christianity, where it's like, well, we're clearly separated very early on from the rest of the animals and from the rest of the, natural world. And so there's like these two different narratives, and they coexist in a country like Japan, but how that kind of shapes the way, how reverent we are about the material world and the human created material world. And it comes down to something like recycling.
And maybe this is where like it connects to Erica's thing, where like if it was like living before, you still can maintain that sense of animism, even after you start using it as like a human-made thing.
Yeah, it's interesting. Why is wood seem more valuable than plastic?
Yeah,
because it was a living thing, maybe.
Well, plastic was also a living thing. It's just that it was buried before and dug up and processed the shit out of, and then you get plastic.
Yeah, and you more disconnected. But wood retains a lot of its tangible, visible character from the state that you see it in the environment, where plastic is not at all.
And it also goes back to what Erica was saying with like that element of craft. Like a lot of those wood-made things, there's a handmade element to it.
The thing Rob brought up about if the spiritual frame, or whatever you want to call that way of like dividing up nature, culture, and what's animate, inanimate, the question of like what precedes that or how is that shaped, I think is like open, because like Japan like is everything's complex. So like they actually burn all of their trash as well. They're like the only country that burns all of it, which is weird, but partly because they don't have the space and partly some other reason, I'm sure. And that's not obviously like environmentally the most friendly thing to do. And yeah, there's just so much packaging waste and whatnot. I think during like the Edo period, because it's an island, they essentially, and they've always been somewhat insular, they just ran out of resources. They actually like wiped out all the forests and stuff like that. And so they had to like, that's when you get that sense of like craftsmanship and whatnot that comes from Japan, like stereotypically these days, is like some people link it back to this moment when they basically just wiped out all of their resources. And we're living in like a dead landscape and we're like, oh, okay, like we got to learn new ways of handling these materials, you know.
Yeah.
But they had that Shinto whatever thing the whole time. It's just like what caused what is the question. I'm sure there's a link to some extent. And then the other thought I had was just like, I don't know if that notion of it being totally separate, collective versus individual response, like holds that well, because I think of recycling as it's a collective protocol that we're like asked to act out individually, but it's still like a collective decision and infrastructure. And just because it's fake doesn't mean that the embedding of those kinds of behaviors isn't like a decent model for thinking about what the real thing that comes next, you know?
Yeah.
Because you'll
That's
have
fair.
to shape people's behaviors through some kind of collective protocol. And it's good that we're at least thinking about it, even though I think it's true that all these, plastics literally can't be recycled, period. And many other items that can be recycled aren't, because it's not economically efficient. I think that like notion of it being a grift is like coming to the fore, and that's true.
Yeah, no, that's an interesting point. I take that point for sure. For any collective response, a collective is a group of individuals in the end, right? There is a collective protocol that individuals have to act out. And like, I guess like what you can learn from this is that there is a massive scale behavioral shift that can happen and behavioral responsibility that can happen, as we saw with recycling, where people feel the sense of responsibility to go and take their things and recycle them. Whether it does something or not is a different question, but we have massively shifted people's behavior, individual behavior. The question is, what are new individual behaviors that we collectively have to decide upon? But I think it needs to be more top down, because in the end, like the implications are so massive. The people who are responsible for creating most of the plastic waste are so embedded in the ways we do things, and the massive companies, and our entire way of living is predicated on it, right? So to me, it's like an argument of something that's top down. Maybe collective versus individual is the wrong way of talking about it.
I'd be curious to understand like the politics of the packaging and supply chains and stuff at like Coca-Cola or PepsiCo or whatever, and what challenges are. If there's a conversation internally at one of those large soda companies about like, okay, we could switch by this year to strictly like refillable bottles using fountains or whatever, what kinds of resistance there is from bottling factories, which I believe are all their own companies and stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Distributed in different regions and stuff, and how it ties back to oil companies and so on.
Yeah, how does the transition happen? What are the incentives that are created?
We just got to get Coca-Cola on tap and we'll solve it. It's the policy change we need.
Oh, grow your own Coca-Cola.
That too.
I guess it's a bit of like that reframing of what's being done with the current onslaught of plastics. It would be really cool to see more experimentation with that process, or like what ends up being done with the plastic that's already being incurred.
Signal annoys me.
Strong signal. I think it's an indication of this changing social consciousness. And yeah, like Uda was saying, I'm curious to see like how do we leverage this for like the next collective transformation.
Erica?
I would hope it's a signal towards like, that collective consciousness, people like understanding that there are other ways of being and knowing and understanding and working with materials, I guess, and in terms of recycling, being more conscious of their waste.
Baldas, signal or noise?
There's been a lot of like uncertainty. I would call it uncertainty maybe, in terms of like what the frame is for both how change will happen, like if it's a consciousness issue or if it's like something else. And then also like the question of like what the frames are for thinking about the relationships between our system of production and our like systems of life and living on the planet. And I'm trying not to use the word nature culture because they have such baggage from a certain period that maybe, yeah, we need new ways of talking about what those things are. And so I think there's lots of things you could point to in that space, you know, ways of thinking that signal new ways of thinking about the interconnection between those things, you know, from ecological economics to ideas of like planetary metabolism to all sorts of ways of just like framing the links that we have between production and living systems. That I think Udit is right, is like shifting, that it's not going to be, or maybe it could be actually, it could still hold, but it's uncertain whether the kind of nature culture hard divide will be like the framing device for the coming century.
You have a framing device for the next 100 years that you would propose?
An organism approach.
There you go. Yeah, I wonder if there's something on this mass, I don't know if we call it hallucinations, mass deception of recycling, and whether that changes anything. It's hard for me to see this as like a signal or more than just like a cycle or something. There seems to be a bunch of conversations you're bringing up that have come up many times in history, particularly like around collective action. I have noticed that there's a distinction people are drawing between ethical consumption and consumer activism, I guess, which is, I think, very related to what you're talking about, and that just consumer activism is not making different shopping choices or refusing to or banning certain brands, but changing policy, changing legal frameworks, changing the way companies operate. And that seems to be a conversation at the moment, which is somewhat related. Seems like it's always obvious though, and it also seems like ethical consumption, I suppose, can be a way of influencing those types of policy changes. Like, I think even that's like a false distinction to be making, or a fallacious distinction to be making between those two things. I'll say it's a signal. Broadcast from later.